Okay, welcome to the Digital Media Essentials tutorial number one. This is about digital media files, and it's a course I recently taught at a pay television company. We're going to talk a little bit about various digital media file types, the kind of files that you encounter in digital media, and give you a little bit of an overview and vocabulary so that you have an idea of what the landscape looks like. And then we'll point at a couple of more complex topics and point you in a few directions for some deep geek stuff. Okay, let's get started. So, first of all, digital media files are just like all the other files that you encounter on your computer, right? Files that have text, word processing, documents, and email files, and all the little stuff on your desktop. Digital media files are really no different. There's some kind of specialized stuff about them, and we'll talk a little bit and get you a little bit more familiar. They're all around us, computer files are, and we're going to create the digital future together. And we ought to understand what these files look like. So let's learn a little bit. So we'll talk about files and file formats. We'll give you a little bit of overview of vocabulary, a couple of examples. We'll talk about how we categorize some of these digital media files, how they're stored, what files look like at studios. And then point you in a couple of directions for subjects to kind of do a Google search on and get more information. So the first step is to understand our vocabulary. Right? We want to know a little bit about the landscape. Well, let's understand some of the words that we use. All right, and it looks like a lot, but once we kind of get a overview, a little bit of a definition of what these words mean, we'll be a whole lot more comfortable in the space. There's lots of acronyms, lots of abbreviations. There's references to products that are used in the space. And a little bit of an understanding of some of those topics will make us a whole lot more able and capable when dealing with folks that deal with digital media. So, when we're talking about a file, digital media files, we want to talk about their metadata, right? The data about the stuff in the file, or the data about the file itself. So what's the file type? What's the file format? How big is it? Who created it? When was it created? When was it last accessed? When was it last modified? And then inside the file, there might be metadata that's a little bit more specific that talks about the essence of the file. So that file might be a video file, and it might be a video clip that's part of a movie. So we'd want to know that name, the name of the shot. We'd want to know the name of the reel, right, back from the reel of film. We want to know the title of the movie. We want to know the author, maybe. We want to know the owner of this content. We might want to know information about the layout or the structure of the content. If it's a database, for example, we might want to know the location. Right? And digital files, as we said, are media files. So let's talk a little bit more. Want to know what items we care about? Well, we care about the file's type, its format, its codec, its wrapper. Right? So digital media gets encoded and decoded. So we want to know what codec was used to encode that media so that we can decode it. We want to know how was that media wrapped up. So you might have a movie that's exactly the same encode, but wrapped up differently for a Windows computer and wrapped up differently for a QuickTime computer, for an Apple computer. And those guys use different formats. We'll talk about that. What's a file? Logical piece of data. So it might be a little bit of text. It might be a PowerPoint presentation or an email box. It might be a picture. It might be a movie. We care a lot about pictures and movies and audio files, sounds. Right? We'll talk about those. Well, file type is how you can distinguish one kind of file from another on the computer. And so there's different ways of doing that. And on your computer, when you put the file on your desktop, it shows up with a different icon. And that icon is determined by the file's type. And we'll talk about how files are distinguished from one another. We'll talk about the file format, how the file's organized, what's in the file, how it's laid out. We'll talk about the codec, how the file was encoded, how the media in the file was encoded, and how the media in the file gets decoded. So how to kind of create the essence in the file and how to read the essence in the file. We'll talk about the wrapper, so how that file is that same essence, that same sound, or that same movie with the same codec is identified differently on the different types of computers. On a Windows computer, on an Apple computer, on a Linux computer, Unix computer. So for media files, we care about, as we said, it's the file's type, its format, and that format will include the codec for video and the codec for audio. And then once we talk about the codec for video, you'll want to know, well, how much data does it take per second to play this file back? Its data rate. You'll want to know pixel sizes, pixel aspect ratios. Not all pixels are square for digital media. Well, now they are. But for the kind of sources that digital media folks deal with, traditional television, not high-def television, the pixels themselves weren't square. That's subject for another day, but pixel aspect ratio is, can play into things. For the audio, you'll want to know its data rate, its sample rate, how many samples were taken per second to create that file. You'll want to know how many bits per sample. And then you'll want to know the wrappers for those files, for which computer. Some are more friendly than others. The Mac wrapped files work better on the Mac, and Windows wrapped files work better on Windows, right? Obvious. Maybe not obvious. So let's talk about one type of file, right? So we talked about these different categories that we care about. Now we'll talk about one specific file. So there's one file. It's a Windows Media Video file. Has the extension .wmv. The format's Windows Media. The codec, specific Windows Media codecs. The video is Windows Media Video 9. The data rate there is 1 megabit per second, so 1 megabit of data for every second of that video. The size of that video is 320 by 240 pixels. The aspect ratio is square, right, 1:1. For the audio, the Windows audio codec is Windows Media Audio 9. Sample rate, as you see it, 48 kilohertz, 48,000 samples are taken every second. The data rate, 128 kilobits per second are necessary to play that audio back. It's 16-bit audio. Every single sample, every single one of those 48,000 samples taken every second is 16 bits wide. That's what CDs use. And then the file wrapper is Windows Media Wrapper. Lots of details, right? But now when somebody says to you, I'm going to hand you a media file, and you say, well, what kind of file? And they say, well, it's a Windows file. There's lots of questions to ask, and here's some examples of answers to those questions. Let's ask those questions and make sure that we can play those files back. Here's another kind of file for the Mac. It's a QuickTime file. You'll want to know what file format, what codecs are used, and what wrappers used. And so here's an example of different codecs and data rates, pixels, samples, rates, etc. This video is also 1 megabit per second. It's 320 by 240 pixels. They're square. The audio is 44.1, 44,100 samples per second. They're also 16 kilobit or 16 bits wide, sorry. The data rate of this audio is 96 kilobits per second. Takes a little bit less data to play this audio back because there's not as many samples taken per second. And you think you can pretty much do the math and come up with these results, the data rate from taking the sample rate times the bit depth. And maybe this stuff is, anyway. Sometimes you can do that, sometimes you can't. So, files. File type. Well, at a high level, it says, can I deal with this file or not? So this is a Windows file for my Windows machine. Is it a Mac file for my Mac machine? What kind of file type? Is it a Windows Media file? Is it a QuickTime file? And is it a file that contains media that I'm interested in and that I can play back? Do I have the codec and decodec? And you know, the decoder for the media that this stuff was encoded with. Encoder-decoder pair. Can I decode it? And so that codec matters a lot. I want to encode a file in a format that people can decode it. I want to know that I can decode a file when I'm going to receive it. Now, if you're involved in security, you might want to encode a file in a format that people can't readily decode, and that's a subject for another day. Those of us receiving files, we want to know that we have the right codec so we can decode it. We can play the file. We want to know that that codec works for the media player we're going to use. So we want a QuickTime codec, QuickTime decoder, QuickTime player for Windows, or a QuickTime player for the Mac, or sometimes more specific formats, but let's keep it at a high level today. When we're going to encode the file, we want to make sure that we can encode that file so people can watch it. So, we'll determine who's going to receive the file. We'll make sure that they can receive it, they can play it, they can decode it, and then we'll make the file for them. A little further, how do we categorize files? Well, right, by the contents, it's text or binary. Computer science might say, well, everything else follows, but we're media guys, we'll be more specific because we're doing this for a job. Text file we can read, it's human readable. Binary file is machine readable. Right? Text files, some examples are like email, XML, edit decision lists for your various editors, and binary files are computer programs. You can't open up the computer program in a text editor and read it. Media file, you can't. You can't open up a QuickTime file in your text editor and read it. There's nothing there to read the way you can open up an email file. So how do we categorize files? By their contents, text, binary, whether it's a computer program, media file, specifically, maybe it's a picture, sound file, video file. Text files can be structured or unstructured. Binary file, computer program, we're going to care what computer it runs on. A media file, we're going to care if it's raw, wrapped, or part of a sequence. We've been talking about wrapped files up until now, but when you get a little deeper, you can be dealing with raw files that don't even tell you what's in them, and then you need to know exactly what's in them so you can write a piece of code to decode them, to open them. Files might be part of a sequence too, so there might be a bunch of computer graphic images that represent an animation when you play them quickly one after the other. Alright, so let's pause here. And that's going to be the end of tutorial part 1. Look out for part 2 where we'll continue on just from right here. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope we didn't go too deep. But the object here is to give you a rough overview of some of the kind of questions that you want to ask when people talk about media files and say, hey, I got a file for you. Well, ask a couple of these questions. Ask what is the file type? Well, how is it? What's it wrapping? What's in it? Is it video? Is it audio? It's video. Okay. Well, what's the codec? What's the data rate? What's the audio codec or data rate? Is it uncompressed or compressed? The more questions that you can ask beyond just, hey, what's the file name, the more your likelihood is of being successful in being able to read the file, being able to be successful at the task in hand, which is, being a capable digital media participant, right, in the digital future. All right, thanks so much. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a like.